When you create a formula, it's usually a good idea to draw the formula's values from the original data source. That way, if the source changes, your formula's result will update the next time Excel recalculates your workbook. But what do you do if your pivot table contains data drawn from an outside source and you can't get at the original tables? In that case, you can refer to a cell within the pivot table using a get pivot data formula. Let's say that you want to use the data in a pivot table cell in your formula. And for that, we'll make it the value in C6, which is the value for January 2009 for firm B. To create this formula, you start typing another formula such as sum. So click any cell outside the pivot table, and then type equal, and then the name of the function, sum, and then a left parentheses. And now you click the cell that you want to use the data from inside the pivot table. So in this case, I'll click cell C6, and you see that Excel creates a get pivot data function, which has a bunch of information inside of it. This information refers to the cell that I just clicked inside the pivot table, and I'll walk you through step by step to show you what it's doing to identify that cell. The first thing it's doing is indicating the field that contains the value. That field name is revenue, and you can see that the sum of revenue field is what's summarized within the body of the pivot table. So that's the first part. The second part is the cell A3. A3 is the first cell at the top left corner of the pivot table. Year indicates the year field, and 2009 is the year that is applied to the cell in C6. So as you can see, the year is 2009, and cell C6 clearly falls within that part of the pivot table. Next, the month is January, and you can see that here. It is in fact for January. And then finally you have the company, which are the columns, and it is firm B. And cell C6 is under firm B, so it is that company's data. Now you can close out the formula by typing a right parentheses and then pressing enter. Normally you wouldn't create such a simple formula as I have here. Instead, you'd use your get pivot data function as part of a larger calculation, but I wanted to keep it simple just for demonstration purposes. So I'll click a cell in the pivot table to bring the pivot table field list back. When you pivot the pivot table, as long as the cell that contains the data you want still appears within the pivot table, then the formula won't change. So let's say that I put company below year and month in the row labels area. When I do that, even though the arrangement of the pivot table has changed, the value of the formula remains the same because the value is still displayed within the pivot table. And you can see that value here. It's currently in cell B7. And if I were to pivot the pivot table back by putting company back in the column labels area, the value goes back to C6 instead of B7, and the formula remains the same. Even though you can pivot your pivot table and have the formula retain its value, if you hide one of the fields that the get pivot data formula uses to identify the proper cell within the pivot table, then the formula will generate an error. So let's say, for example, that instead of having company within the column labels or the row labels area, that I remove it from the pivot table. When I do, the formula in cell F1, which refers to the pivot table cell, generates a reference error. And that's because it no longer has the information that it needs to identify the proper cell within the pivot table. And also, the value for January 2009 for firm B no longer exists within this particular arrangement of the pivot table. You can see that all we have is the sum of revenue for both companies, and it's not broken out by individual company. If I drag the company field header back to the column labels area, then the formula gets restored to its proper order, and it can identify the cell it needs to return a value. Now, if you find that clicking a pivot table cell doesn't generate a get pivot data formula, then it's possible you or someone else might have turned off the option that enables you to do that. To make sure you can use pivot table data in a formula, click the File tab, then click Options, and then on the Formulas tab of the Excel Options dialog box, make sure that the Use Get Pivot Data Functions for Pivot Table References checkbox is selected. When it is, you can create your Get Pivot Data functions the way that I did in this movie. The Get Pivot Data function makes it easy to summarize pivot table data in your worksheets. If it's not practical to draw the data from the original source, you can always use the pivot table reference instead.